Today, I want to welcome Glenn Poulos. He is the co-founder, vice president, and general manager of Gap Wireless. With over 3 decades of experience in sales, he has developed a successful strategy system by spending thousands of hours in the field or on the phone with customers and working with salespeople in several successful companies. Glenn, welcome to Leaders and Legacies.
Hi, Craig. Thanks so much for having me today.
You know, this has been an exciting interview. I've been looking forward to it because, I come from the wireless world. I spent, I spent 15 years there before I moved on. And, in the green room, we were talking about many companies that we both knew, people that we both knew. And it's really fun to reconnect with that. Could you, give some folks a little bit on your background. You started 2 companies. What were they? What did they do?
Sure. So, I started my career actually as a government worker, an electronic technician working for the Canadian Weather Service, Environment Canada is what we call it. And up here, and I was working on some weather stations and helping to fix some electronic gadgets and gizmos. And one day my boss pulled me aside and said, you don't really fit the profile we're looking for in the government. And I think he was alluding to the fact that I was maybe working too fast or accomplishing too many tasks per unit amount of time. And he said, you would really thrive in sales, right? And so in 1985, 86 timeframe, I reached out to looking for a job in the technical field and ended up landing a job as a technical sales rep. And I did that job from 86 to 91. And it was sort of just prior to me turning 30. And I approached my bosses and I said, I saw, how much money they were making running this sales business and how lucrative it was. The margins were really good. And I thought they got paid no matter which salesman sold. The other salesman only got paid when the salesman sold, right? And I thought I'd much rather, be the owner than just the salesman, right? So I approached them with an idea around this newfangled technology, right? And I said, I'm sure this is going to be good. And why don't we spin off a division and I'll focus on this little piece of technology and you guys can keep your core business and still own a piece of this new business. And I'll get to be an entrepreneur before I'm 30 and everything will be great, right? And the president said, oh, that's never going to work and some stuff like that. He said, maybe bring me in your plan tomorrow and we'll go over it and I'll show you. You're probably better just sticking to your knitting here and staying with us and blah, 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 et cetera, right? And so the next day I brought in my resignation letter instead and handed it over. Now, I had forgotten a couple things. One, I'd only been married 6 days. And I forgot to tell my wife I was quitting. So I had to go home and tell the wife, oh, by the way, I'm quitting and I'm starting a new business, right? And so I did do that, right? And of course, the technology, it never went anywhere, right? It was totally fangled. It was a cell phone, right? And I mean, who needs a cell phone, right? Like in 1991, right? Who would have thought, right? And but yeah,
hey, let me pause you there because sure. I think there's some perspective. I mean, there are people who never knew a time when there weren't multiple cell phones in the house.
Right.
What was it like back then?
Well, it's funny. One of the chapters in my book is called Never Fax the Facts or Ship the Shit, right? And I mean, people are like, what do you mean faxes? Nobody uses faxes. And I said, well, in 1986 or 87, just after I got that job, we went from teletype, this typing machine we had, to a fax machine. And the whole world changed. And in 88, I think I got my first Motorola brick phone, and then a car, one of those stationary car phones. And of course, I was the only one of my friends that had a car phone. And, who would have ever thought it would go to where it got to, right? And I remember when the Nokia 9190s, I can't remember the model number, but then it was the very, very popular Nokia little portable handset. Loved that phone. And it was the one with the 3-digit texting, right? Where you could text blindly. And because as long as you remember, like E was double tap on that, all that stuff, right? But it was interesting watching the mobile phone grow. And I was lucky because I was a salesman in the mobile wireless business that always had a cell phone. But, so many of the people are like, oh no, don't call me on the cell phone. Only call me on the landline. It's too expensive. And, the minutes and the this and the that. And of course now, I mean, it's, I called my carrier. I went to Europe for a few weeks this summer and, just went country to country to country to country using my own phone number, data, everything. And, my, now you can roam the world with a cell phone and, using your at-home rates, and it's amazing. Like and frankly, I love it, but, yeah, so it's been interesting.
When I worked for Ericsson in the late 90s, I remember the management saying that they expected the saturation rate of cell phones to be 50%. That meant 1 out of every 2 people would have a cell
Right.
phone.
Yeah.
And their goal was to get to that point where 1 out of every 2 people had a cell phone.
Right.
And we passed that years ago.
Oh yeah, for sure.
But
Yeah.
this, I mean, you're talking about a time that was even before that. It was,
Oh yeah.
you had to be either a businessman with a very nice expense account,
Yeah.
or enormously wealthy to have a cell phone.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Yeah. Like our phone bills were over $1,000 a month kind of thing. Right. And, yeah, it was, and I was fortunate that my employer, and then of course I had to own the company, so I paid my own phone bill. But I mean, always had one, and I have the same phone number that I can't remember the exact year I got the phone. It was 87, 88, something like that. But the phone number that I got from it was at the time it was Cantel, which became Rogers in Canada, a very big cell phone company. And I have ported over now. I'm actually with TELUS, but I've had the same phone number since day one, right? And I'm this like sort of this like bastion of safety that everyone who knows me knows. Well, everyone has Glenn's phone number memorized, right? Because it's never changed in 30 years, right? So all my kids, who's getting called if someone needs to get bailed out, right?
Yeah.
Because everybody else, their cell phone numbers change. And nowadays, cell phone numbers are this random collection of digits where, like every 3 days they make up a new area code, right? And before, everyone like in Toronto was 416, right? Or the 6 as Drake would say, right? And in the suburbs were 905s, and everyone knows that Texas, I think, it's like 214, and all these areas, you just know it by their area codes. But now all those area codes are, there's so many other supplementary area codes because of all the SIM cards in play, right? And but yeah, who would have thought? You said 1 out of every 2 people. Now people have like 4 or 5 SIMs per person, right? Like they got their iPad has a SIM, my iWatch has a SIM, my phone has a SIM, and I have a data modem too, right? So I have 4 SIMs, I guess, right? And it's incredible.
Yeah, it's been a wild shift. I mean, and the cool thing is you were way back. I mean, you were ahead of me. I got my first cell phone in 95. And so you're what, 7, 8 years ahead of me on that.
Oh yeah. 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 I was in the 80s, and mine was in the late 80s, like 87 or 88. And yeah. And it was the first one was the car, that was the fixed phone. Then I got the bag phone. It wasn't the other way around, right? And I had that portable thing, and I thought I was like, I don't know what I thought. I was James Bond or something, right? With this like, I don't know how many pounds it was, 3, 4, 5 pound brick with the phone attached to the giant battery, and all analog, technology, blasting 3 watts, of RF energy out, without even thinking about it. Right. And, yeah, so times have definitely changed. That's for sure.
So, and I cut you off earlier. So you went off and you started this business,
Yeah. Yeah. So I started the business, and and we were basically selling to people that were developing products for the mobile wireless business. So in Canada, companies like Nortel, later BlackBerry, RIM, companies like that, and also to the carriers themselves, selling them products that help them to build out the network, right? So the only thing I never really sold were cell phones, right? And we sold into people that were doing handset development. We sold people that were doing antenna developments. We sold antennas. We sold cable connectors, all sorts of combiners, and things that go up on the tower. When you look up on a cell phone tower, that's everything I still do to this day. That's what we sell, is all that stuff. When you're in a stadium and you look up, you see all those antennas that are helping to propagate signal. So you're getting, full coverage in a stadium. We sell those systems. We sell the antennas. Yeah, that's all the stuff we do. And we help make wireless work. And we say there's a lot of wires in wireless. Yeah. And we sell wires, right? And
so let's get a couple things on the record. Does 5G cause COVID?
Definitely not. Definitely not. And if you go to my website, you can download our newsletter that covers the 5G health report. It's a very highly downloaded article and series of articles that we had written, and with a lot of experts and things like that. And it does not cause cancer, does not cause COVID. Definitely not.
The cancer one I understand, because there's always been links, but the one that really surprised me was when they started saying it caused COVID.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's also tinfoil hats available. I mean, but yeah, I mean, I do at a base level, I understand the conspiracy theories behind it all and what have you, but I mean, that's not one that I buy into myself, right? You might get me to talk about the moon landing or some other things, but COVID from 5G, that one definitely not. No, that one.
So true story, the CEO of Ericsson, and for those that don't know, Ericsson, major wireless company, provides a lot of the infrastructure, built the very first Bluetooth radio, which I saw before the original prototype. Wow. And the CEO of Ericsson had to put out an announcement to the entire company saying, no, 5G does not cause COVID.
Right. Oh, wow. Yeah.
I mean, that's that's just scary when the head of a technology company has to tell its technology employees, no, 5G doesn't cause COVID.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that was sort of a unique time with a unique set of fears. And I mean, every fear had to be quelled at that time. So there was just no choice in the matter, right? Because I mean, he probably had to address all sorts of other fears at the same time, and how they were going to handle social distancing and who gets to work from home. And and that was very interesting. I mean, our company, we couldn't shut down during COVID because all my administrative staff went home, but I had to keep the warehouse open. Our warehouse people had to come to work every day because all of our customers, which were carriers that had to provide you with, cell phone signal without fail, needed us to stay open so we could supply them with the products they used to build the network and keep it running. Right. So we were mandated, as a essential service to stay open. And so, throughout COVID, I sat in the office here. I usually had one person, and everyone else sort of worked from home, right? But I came in pretty much every day through COVID to keep the warehouse open and keep those guys in the back supported. So,
let's talk about that from a from a leadership perspective. That was a hard time for a lot of people, and what were some of the issues that you faced from your employees? Some of the challenges. Where did they need leadership from you, and how did you kind of guide them through that time?
Yeah, so I remember in the beginning, the one thing that I remember, the first sort of, there was a kind of an inkling, and then maybe it was the next day I had play tickets to a play, and it was still fine. There was no impact on the event. But the information coming to me on my phone, news and whatever during that play, I remember on the break calling my business partner and saying, tomorrow we need to issue a statement to the staff, explaining to him what our COVID strategy will be. And, he kind of took at the time, it was new to everybody, right? So, but he was like, aren't you blowing it a little bit out of proportion? And I'm like, I'm not saying we have to shut our doors or anything. At this point, I think there were rumblings of Italy closing down or whatever. But I'm like, no, I said, like, what we need to do is we need to provide ongoing information to our people so that they know how to govern themselves, right? We can't keep our cards close to our chest during such a thing. And to me, it's going to be all about, we're going to be looked back upon the information that we shared to our people, and how consistent was it, and what basis did we issue our policies and procedure, right? So we we tried to default to government sort of recommendations throughout the pandemic. Obviously, I mean, in the end, that's what everyone did. But you know, I was like, what's the Ontario government doing, and what's the Canadian government saying, and what have you. And then, but the biggest thing for me was this continuous sharing of the information with our staff, so there was no question in their mind. And then you know, there was a lot of pushback from in 2019. I changed our ERP system, our accounting system, and I said, we're going paperless. We're not going to kill any more trees. And everyone's like, oh, well, it'll never work. And they were all grumbling, and they had to learn this new system where there was no paper gets printed, right? And obviously, when we do a packing slip on the box, that actually does get a piece of paper. But I mean, we used to have these files that would travel around the building from all the different, the order entry, the quoting department, the, you know, quality department. Everyone would check it stamps, and we had this whole system of stamps that everyone had on their desk, right? So, and we go stamp, 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 and we'd stamp all these file folders, and all that was gone, right? And like, how are we going to do without the stamps? And a year later, COVID came, and I was able to go across the street to Best Buy and buy a bunch of laptops and send with the day I decided everyone was going home, the next day they were at home working without even blinking of an eye, because we didn't need to be in the office because our accounting system was in the cloud. Right. And as long as you had the VPN access and you had a laptop, I went out and got everyone a laptop, and that didn't already have one. Right. These were office desk workers. Right. And sent them all home. And it was like, wow, going paperless, that was genius. Right. I'm like, you didn't say that a year ago.
Yeah.
But it really ended up being one of the great moves that we did, was going paperless to allow us to send people home so quickly. Right. And, you know, and we operated throughout the entire, you know, melee of changes that came in Canada. There were lots of comings and goings, openings and closings, and, you know, lockdown, not lockdown, you know, and we were able to operate flawlessly throughout that whole time, which was great, you know.
You know, and I think that's one of the tough things about leadership is there's a part where you have to make people constantly uncomfortable, but you have to make them comfortable with being uncomfortable, which sounds like what you did.
Yeah, exactly. And so, you know, it's often about the, you know, I often get asked about, you know, leadership or whatever. And I said, you know, leadership is making a decision, you know, even during difficult times, right? Like, that's your job. Fundamentally, that is your main job, is making decisions, and during stressful times, during any time. And then, you know, making the decision and then deploying along the lines of the decision that you've made. And then, you know, obviously hoping that you've made the right decision, but your people will follow you pretty much regardless, as long as you're definitive, and, you know, you explain to them what you're doing, why you're doing it, you make the decision, you stick to it. They're looking for someone to make that decision and for someone to rally behind. Right. And, you know, I guess, fortunately, throughout my career, most of my decisions have been right enough that, you know, most things have turned out successfully. Not everything, of course, has been the right decision. And, but that whole business about making decisions, you know, that's really what defines a leader. And as I explained to some of people coming into management, I said, look, if you're a manager and you're doing your job perfectly and all your staff is trained, you shouldn't have anything to do other than make decisions, right? Because every one of your staff is perfectly trained, and you're just managing to the exception, right? Oh, the machine blew up. What do I do? Okay, well, I'll call this guy here. He's a 24-hour service. Get him in, get a quote. Okay, you know, or whatever. We lost this order. What are we going to do? Well, let's talk to the customer, figure out why we lost the business. You know, whatever the problem is, you have to sort of manage to that and come up with strategies and ideas and decisions around it. But other than that, you shouldn't have to do anything, right? And so that's when I often know when things are going well, when I'm kind of might have a moment of boredom, right? Where there's nothing to do. There's no chaos, right? At that moment, there's no drama, and there's no decision to be made at that exact moment. Then I'm sometimes waiting for my email to tell me what to do next, right? And yeah, so that's kind of the way I think about leadership and decision making.
Well, you made another decision recently that I would imagine unnerved a few people. You decided to sell your company.
Yeah, for sure. It's the second company that I sold. The first company, I'll digress briefly because it's definitely newsworthy. So in 2007, no, sorry, in 2005, I sold my business. It was about 13 and a half years old or something like that at the time. And I was making a very good living. The business had grown to 100 people. I was making good money. But of course, a liquidity event changes your sort of your wealth overnight, right? Because you get a lot of money for your business. I and myself and my two business partners, we sold our business to a public company, and we ended up taking shares in the public company as the lion's share of the purchase price. So we did not get a lot of cash. That ended up being a very, very bad choice on our part, right? But overnight I became this multi-millionaire, but also I was this large insider in the business because I own so many shares in the public company now, because they'd given me so many to buy my business, that I couldn't sell the shares I couldn't even start selling them for 90 days. And then I could only sell like 1 or 2% every 90 days for the first sort of 3 years or something. It was an insider trading law, and to prevent us from dumping and, pump and dumps, whatever, all this, anti-scheming laws and whatever that occur in Canada. But that ended up being my downfall, because the company we sold to, we didn't spend enough time researching who was buying us. They spent all sorts of time researching us and making sure our revenues were this and that and what have you. We just assumed, oh, well, they're a public company and they've got all these divisions that we've seen and they have a brand name, and we didn't give it any thought. We thought we died and went to heaven. We're multimillionaires, and but of course I was only a multimillionaire on like paper, because I couldn't sell the shares to turn them into cash to buy sports cars and fancy houses, right? So my life didn't really change. I was kind of making the same amount of money I'd always been making. I was living the exact same lifestyle, but I was this multimillionaire, right? Well, as I tell the story, it can get long-winded. I'll be brief, but within the first day of owning the business, they emptied our bank accounts, took all the money, ran all the lines of credit up to max them out. And from that day forward, we started stretching vendors, not making payments. And we went from being people's number one customer to being the worst nightmare they've ever dealt with. And it was the horrible, horrible transition to go through. And I only had so much I could do. I was really just an employee in this public entity that owned a lot of shares in the business, but it wasn't like I was on the board of directors. It wasn't like I ran the business at that level. Like, the CFO did not, rise to my bidding, right? And within 18 months or so, the company was put into receivership. They closed our company. I had to fire 100 people, and ultimately I was out of work. And ultimately, my shares went to zero, and I had to start over. And in 2007, and I went from multimillionaire to broke in one step, right? I mean, I wasn't totally broke. I'd saved money over the years, but what I mean is, from the money I sold the business was the here today, gone tomorrow, and the shares were worthless. And I had to either get a job or start over. And that's when I created the second company, Gap Wireless, which is my initials, GP, and the A is the vowel that I needed in order to make a word. And much to the chagrin of the Gap clothing company, I'll add, the year I started Gap Wireless was the same year that the Gap clothing company came out with the Gap Wireless bra. And that was a fun exercise in the trademark courts of Canada. And we ended up ultimately winning and keeping our name and all that and getting the trademark. But they were infuriated with us because we were always coming up on top of them in Google because our name is Gap Wireless, right? And but yeah, so I sold my company the second time in 2022, but this time it was to a much better company. We did all sorts of research on it. It was all cash, right? It was an all cash deal. Learned my lesson, and now I'm learning. My new lessons that I'm learning today is, we were bought by private equity, so now I'm actually an employee with a company that's owned by private equity, and I'm not the where the buck stops, right? I'm not the final word. I do manage my division, and they've brought other companies and brought them in under us, but still, I mean, there's a very big engine above me, and there's a decision-making process and authority levels, and it's quite a change and a transition for anyone to make, right? From being the top dog seat of your pants decision making to having to rationalize and explain your decisions, and some have your decisions overridden, right? And so it's interesting, and I am learning a lot though, and I'm sure this information I'll learn over these few years that I'm going to be working with them to be very valuable part of my corporate education, if you will, right? And along with running a business by yourself, not by yourself, but with my partner, and selling that business and what have you, right? So
Yeah. Well, tell me about a time where you feel like your leadership was kind of put to the challenge, almost like a white knuckled moment.
in 2019, I realized that, business goes up and down or what have you, but we'd grown to 80 people. And I'd realized that we were at a turning point in that our service division, climbing towers, installing antennas and things, was at a crossroads, and it was losing money. And my finance guy at the time had not kept us properly informed of how bad it had gotten. And sometimes time just goes by and you realize, like, wait a minute, I was here and now I'm here, and I'm here. Wait a minute, I'm where in terms of the finances? And we were basically staring down the barrel of about $1.4 million in losses. And our company was not the size that could shoulder that kind of a loss, especially because we had a line of credit that we were using at the time, and there were covenants with the bank. And the crossroads of the decision and then an inflection point that you're asking about is that on the Friday, I went home to think about it. On Monday morning, I came in and I called my business partner and I said, we're going to make some changes. And I said, right now we have 80 people. And when we're done, we'll have 29. And he's like, what? And I explained to him, and, we had been negotiating with a company about selling our service division. And we basically were able to get an agreement that day that this guy would buy the service division. I use that word buy loosely because it was more like we gave it, but nonetheless, all 40 people got a job. A smaller group, we were selling some drones and stuff. We sold that division to a US company. It was a successful transaction. And we were able to reduce our headcount from, 80 to 29, just as I said. But as I was telling my partner, he's like, well, when are we going to, this was 8 o'clock in the morning, right? And he's like, well, when are we going to do this? And I said, by 10 a.m. we'll be done. And we were. And we called the guy about the business. We had this lead on selling the drone division. We took care of that. That took care of about 6 or 8 people. I can't remember. And then the rest, we had to lay off a few people, but they all found gainful employment readily. And we went on from after 2019, after this adjustment or restructuring, to have a banner year in profits. We wiped out all the losses. And turned the tables, and we went on to have 2 more banner years of profit that we never would have had. We probably wouldn't have survived if I hadn't have made that decision. And then we sold the business sort of for what I feel is kind of like a record deal in terms of the timing of the 5G and rollout in Canada and the valuation of the business. And I feel we hit the peak of 5G value. Right now we're in a telecom trough in Canada, and business is kind of down a bit. So I think we hit the number perfectly. And and so that's my white knuckle moment in managing the business.
And I think one of the challenges there is sometimes you have to do these cuts to make the other jobs secure.
Exactly. Yeah.
And it's hard when you're impacting people's lives. But if you hadn't saved those 29 jobs,
yeah,
everybody would
be gone. The business would be gone. The bank would have flipped us on the covenants, and we wouldn't have been. I guess we could have sold houses and stuff maybe to try to, but we would have been at that kind of a method of having to guarantee the loans at a point, because there wouldn't have been enough equity to cover the lines of credit that they wanted, the guarantees. But we managed to turn it all around. And we convinced the bank to loan us $5.5 million for this other deal with no collateral. I don't even know how we did that one. I'll have to write a book on that as well. And we just convinced them through sheer passion of the business. We'd made the restructuring. We were back being profitable. And we said, now we need $5.5 million for 90 days to do this deal. And they said yes. And they gave us the money. And we paid it back 100 days later. And it worked beautifully. And we never looked back. Yeah.
Well, that's encouraging. Now you said book. You've got a book out
Yeah.
called Never Sit in the Lobby. What's that book
Yeah.
about?
So it's 57 tips on how to build a business and a career in selling. And it's sort of 57 anecdotes, plus or minus, from my career starting in 85 as a salesman, that I started writing down rules that I learned from different people on how they became good salespeople. And there were rules to follow, rules to avoid, all that kind of a thing. Right. And back in the 80s, I used to tell these, and there's some funny stories behind them, and I tell them in an animated kind of a way. People would laugh, and they're like, oh, and then other people I eventually asked me to speak at their companies and tell these. And then everyone's like, oh, you should write a book. And of course, 25 years went by, but it wasn't until the pandemic that I finally sat down and said, I've got all these notes in this book. Now I'm going to write them down. I'm going to write a book. And I did during the pandemic. And so that's what I did on the weekends. And I published it the same week that I sold the business. The timing, it was not good timing for me, right? Because I would wanted to enjoy them both separately, but literally the same week that the transaction closed and we signed the papers for selling the business, the book went live on Amazon. So it was interesting.
Wow. Well, congratulations. How can people get in touch with you?
So my website's the best. It's glennpoulos.com. And on there are links to all my socials. Super active on LinkedIn. So you can just go to LinkedIn and search my name. And that's where I'm most active. And I'll, if you reach out to me, I'll respond. And, but you can contact me on the website, and my other social media is there as well. So.
And you're doing a lot of public speaking now. So if somebody needs a speaker to convince their audience that 5G doesn't cause COVID.
Yeah, that would be me. Yeah.
All right. But more importantly, on leadership. You've been through a lot, and I appreciate you sharing that. I think it's encouraging for anybody who's struggling in business to know that it's not always a straight line, to where they're going. And I just want to thank you for being on Leaders and Legacies today.
Yeah. Thanks, Craig. Very happy to be here.